Hey everyone, my name is Kavya Raja and I'm a junior from Pleasanton, California. In regards to how I feel about returning back to school, I took a dive into 3 different standpoints: health, education, and my personal opinion. The number one subject in the discussion of school reopenings is the health protocols in place that allow schools to reopen in the first place. Now that all high schoolers are eligible to get the vaccine, I think that schools should enforce everyone to get it so that everyone is safe. Additionally, I think that schools should take all possible precautions, including hourly sanitations and recurring classroom cleanings. From an educational standpoint, I felt that I did not learn much in online school. In person, you get to interact with teachers and students, boosting my overall quality of education and helping me learn better. Personally, I feel that school is much more valuable in person. Without the perpetual distraction of screens and all of its implications, you simply get a better quality of education in person. With the appropriate health and safety precautions, school reopening should be thoughtfully considered and carried out to benefit all students' education. Thank you.
I have mixed feelings about going back to school in person. Of course, I love the social aspect that school provides me with by being able to talk to my fellow students and have questions to my teachers. Although, since we've been inside our houses for over a year now, I think people have started to lose their skills to just have normal conversations with one another. So even if we were able to go back to normal, I don't think we ever could because things have just changed so drastically since the pandemic started.
So how I feel about returning to in-person teaching next fall after having this whole past year of remote learning definitely has a strong sense of duality to it. And that's mainly because in one sense, I feel as though it'll be quite cathartic going back to in-person learning. I personally thrive on being in the classroom, engaging more directly with the professors and with the material. I feel as though that's really where I perform best as a student. At the same time, on the other side, it's so important that we're conscious about our own health, the health of our family, and of course, the health of those around us. And so I know we have done very well, or most of us have done really well, trying to keep our safety a priority, and also the colleges have done well to prepare for in-person learning, but still it is a concern about doing our best to keep safe. So that's how I feel.
Beams, y'all. Sandro Defy, aka the Gorilla Poet Laureate, aka the Hoodie God, aka Spitting Quarantino, aka I wear my sunglasses at night because my eyes are as sensitive as my heart is, y'all. And we are back with episode 27 of the Master of Community Health live stream. Every week, we catch up with the leading medical professionals outside the hospital to talk theory, practice, and everything in between. Tonight is no different. We are joined by UCLA's Dr. and Professor Michael Rodriguez. And we are also joined by Dr. and author Anthony Hatch, y'all. We'll also be talking about the possible Roe v. Wade reopening by the Supreme Court, a surge in homicides in California, and we are busting brain myths tonight. That's right. Have you ever heard that we only use 10% of our brains, or that we are left-brained or we're right-brained? Come to find out, well, we'll get to that later. Let's start the show off like we always do with the weekly Rona update. So this story comes to us from Wired. Buried within the bleak news about the COVID-19 pandemic have been some bright spots. Social distancing, lockdowns, and masking, which reduce viral transmission, also seem to have quenched some of the other respiratory diseases that circulate in the winter. This means influenza, RSV, enterovirus D68. This year, the surveillance networks that keep track of those diseases could barely find them. The National Flu View map maintained by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which visualizes the season's intensity in traffic light colors, has barely budged out of the green since fall, y'all. This is a good thing. One pandemic was more than enough in preventing 38 million illnesses and 22,000 deaths. The flu's toll in the United States during the 2019-2020 season, for those of you asking, counts as a win. And yet, some researchers are worried. The downward trends in flu and other respiratory diseases show us how good we were at avoiding any contact we could and sanitizing like mad when we couldn't, but they may also be a warning of unintended consequences to come. It is accepted doctrine in immunology that exposure to routine infections and common microbes early in life helps our immune systems learn what they should target and what to leave alone. Failure to get those exposures at the right time leaves the immune system overreacting to every minor insult. It's possible, though, this is still speculation, that one of the long term effects of this past year could be an increase in allergies and related diseases such as eczema, asthma, particularly in children who were babies and toddlers as the pandemic began. The group that's going to have suffered most during this whole issue of confinement is going to be the young children, toddlers, children from the first year to 3 years of life, says Graham Rook, a physician and professor of medical microbiology at University College London, whose work supports this possible effect. That's the critical period for having the right microbiota in place. While acting out of the best intentions, the need to reduce the spread of a novel, lethal virus, we have created a worldwide natural experiment in reducing exposure to microbes of all kinds. Every other example in our history in which we disrupt exposure to good microbes has had unintended consequences, says Brett Finley, a microbiologist and professor at the University of British Columbia and author of the book Let Them Eat Dirt. A child born by C-section has a 25 to 30% higher chance of getting obesity and diabetes because they don't encounter the vaginal and fecal microbes of a normal birth. When you treat kids with antibiotics, they have a much higher rates of obesity and asthma later in life. Finley is one of 23 prominent researchers from 6 countries who warned in February in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about the long-term consequences to children of the hyper-hygienic lockdown world. They're not going to daycare. They're not playing with the neighbors' kids. If they were born during this time, they were kicked out of the hospital early, he says. My guess is that 5 years from now, we are going to see a bolus of kids with asthma and obesity who were the COVID kids. To understand these predictions, it's necessary to dip into immunology and particularly into the hygiene hypothesis, a concept that's been evolving for more than 30 years. It aims to explain how our immune systems learn what they should try to combat. Its original version, the hypothesis, started as a short letter to the British Medical Journal in 1989, suggesting an explanation for a well-documented rise in allergies after 1950, a period when increasing industrialization and intensified food production were supposed to be making the world more healthy, not less. So our first guest tonight is Professor and Vice Chair in the Department of Family Medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. He is also the founding director of the Health Equity Network of the Americas and the UCLA Blum Center on Poverty and Health in Latin America. His research and policy activities focus on health equity, immigrant health, intimate partner and gun violence prevention, and universal health care. He is a strong community advocate and professional who has consulted for the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the Pan American Health Organization, the CDC, and the Institute of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, to the show, y'all. Hey, Dr. Rodriguez, how are you doing today?
Loving life. Good to be here with you, Andrew.
Absolutely, same. So, first of all, as a family medicine physician, what are your thoughts on the recent changes in mask mandates? Do you think we're ready to open schools in all the parts of California?
Well, when the CDC comes and looks at the science and says, wow, people who are vaccinated are really protected. And this means that those people don't need the same protections as they did when they were not vaccinated, and that they don't even transmit the virus as well, or at least much, much, much less. And so for me, it gives me hope. It makes me think that, boy, we, at least those of us here in California and in the US, are headed in the direction that we want to go. So it is certainly an optimistic one that tells us that we're doing what we need to be doing. And at the same time, I read the newspapers and sort of see the challenges that some people have with that message, because for some people they're kind of, well, how do I do this? How are we going to operationalize this? What happens when we're in a mixed company and whatnot? And so those are the issues that we continue to encounter anytime we're dealing with new things and we're learning new things. And so I say it is a good news because more people are getting vaccinated. And so things are opening up. We're learning more information. As we learn, the information is being shared. And it's also, we learn lessons. We also got to learn how we communicate and what the implications are so that we can do things in a way that keeps everybody with us.
So it was also recently announced that children as young as 12 years old can now be vaccinated. What should parents with children in this age group know when deciding whether or not to get their children vaccinated?
That this vaccine is being recommended in the same way that other vaccines that they have their children, by and large, get. And it is done for the children's protection, because while fewer children than adults are being impacted by the COVID pandemic, and fewer of them get symptoms and get sick, we do know that children do. And children do get what's called this lung syndrome, and children do get hospitalized, and some children also die as a result, particularly those who may have more chronic disease or other issues, but not limited to that. And so we don't want any child to die. And so what we want to do is we want to protect children and protect those people around the children. We want to promote environments that are healthy. And so the reason why we don't go down lower is because we don't have the data yet to make sure that it's safe. So we'll go according to the data that we get, and then that reminds us and reassures us that we're headed in the right direction. So again, it's all about making community connected and making children safe, because they are our future, and we want to make sure that ultimately they can have a great environment and they can go back to school with their friends, that promotes their happiness, and have them enthusiastic about learning and moving on forward as well.
Thank you. That was super helpful. So to shift gears a little bit, through your entire career, you've been a tireless advocate for addressing health disparities in immigrant and Latinx populations specifically. Can you tell us a bit about how these communities have been uniquely impacted by COVID-19?
Yes. Well, the reason why I'm an advocate is because I am Latino. My parents came over from Latin America. My mother's Mexican. My father was from El Salvador. They both immigrated while they were teenagers, came here, worked hard all their lives. So I'm the first person to graduate from high school. And as a result, we moved around a lot, depended on the church to help us. And so these circumstances that I witnessed, where limited income, trying to make do, hard work, are circumstances that many other Latino communities face. These are environments where income is limited, work is hard, but work is good. Income comes in, but the work is limited, and so these also shape the selection for communities they live in, schools they go to, the safety around the communities. the kinds of grocery stores that are around or that are not around, and also the risks that are involved. And so we know that the Latino community has historically, one, had long lives, longer than what you expect. At the same time, the quality of life has been challenged because we have higher rates of chronic disease, and these health challenges are ones that we find are contributed to based on where we live. And so these are what we refer to as inequities, or things that Latinos face greater, primarily because of poverty and what that does with regards to the choices that they have. Well, COVID just put everything under a microscope, magnified everything in terms of made it big, because we saw the same thing with COVID. So as you know, and most people here listening to this show know, that everybody was being told to put a mask on, social distance. We were at home, those of us who could be at home. But most of the jobs that or a higher proportion of the jobs for the Latinos they're in places that don't allow them to stay home. They're in these essential jobs. Some of them are construction. Some of them are in the food services sector. And so they gotta be out there many times interacting with the public. And so even though these are essential jobs, they're not very high paying. They're pretty limited, which limits your choice about where you can live. Many times you got to have several families in the same place, in the same apartment, that are sharing the costs. And while that creates a community, it also increases the number of people who are potentially exposed. And so that's what we do. Bless you, by the way. And so I recognize that the risks are there, that then have made Latinos be one group amongst others that have been at higher risk for infection, as well as for the complications of being infected and being ultimately sick, as well as hospitalized in intensive care units, and ultimately dying at higher rates than non-Latinos.
And there are barriers that exist to vaccinating undocumented immigrants in California as well, right?
Yes. Great point there, Andrew. There are significant barriers on top, and one is the fact that there are challenges, because when we first started rolling out the vaccinations, they were mostly in clinical settings or settings that required a car to get to. And many of these immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, don't have cars, right? They have less funding, less money, so they don't have the resources to get there. They can't leave the work as well. Also, some people may be afraid. Some people are afraid that, well, if I go there, they're going to ask me for ID and I don't have it. Or if I go there, they're going to ask me for some money and I don't have that. And so they'll have these perceptions. Or what is also happening, unfortunately, is that there are these campaigns that provide information about the vaccination, that the vaccination itself, the vaccine, has potential harms. And some of it talks about chips in the vaccine. Some of it talks about sort of the ways in which it affects the sex lives of people. Some of it talks about it being done too quickly. And so many of these are misinformation, and they're done in Spanish. They're done using the social media platforms that many Latinos, particularly Spanish speakers, use. And so they hear this, it's then reinforced by other people, they get afraid, and then they become hesitant. And so, yes, these are a number of other barriers that we find. Not to mention the whole issue about fears of using some public system, and that the use of a public system to get a vaccine may go against their ability to have a regular immigration status. That's called the public charge sometimes, and so we have found that that is something that makes people more hesitant just to use any kind of a service that relates to health and is public.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So while I have you here, I want to make sure we cover the whole breadth of your work. Because on top of your work in Latinx health, you've also been studying gun violence and domestic violence for 25 years. Can you talk about why, as a physician, you chose to study these forms of violence, and how does doing so fit into your larger goal and mission of improving public health?
Sure. Thank you. Those are great questions. Well, when I was first starting my career, and I was coming back to San Francisco, where I was born, to do that work and just start to learn how to do research and all of that work, and combine that to my medical background as being a family physician, I was looking for, what am I going to do? How am I going to make my mark? And I ended up being asked to provide some advice to a program that was caring for women who were suffering from domestic violence. And this program would have a beeper that would that the emergency department would use to tell them, hey, we've got a woman who needs somebody to hold her hand and comfort her, provide her with support. In the emergency department, she got beat up, and so by a boyfriend or a husband. And so this program continued to do that, and they say, you know what? These folks in the emergency room, they don't know much about what's going on in this condition. We need to have a program that's going to help to inform them. And I looked into that, and I went, well, you know what? I know something about medicine. And we found out that the way that they were addressing domestic violence was all about the police and all about responding to it. But here we were in the emergency room with the health impacts of violence. And so I said, well, instead of always just working on it afterwards, why don't we do some, if it impacts health, we know that there are things that we can do to promote health. Why don't we use what we've learned from other areas so that we can prevent health from happening, help people to understand what's going on, so that when we come in, we can understand ways to help provide people with some support to not only take care of their physical, as well as address emotional traumas that they're experiencing, but also help to connect them with support that will help them in the journey to get free of the violence. At the same time, support their decision-making process about what makes them safe. And so for me, that information and that vision was one that then fed a movement, a social movement that made domestic violence and violence in general a public health issue. So that now we, instead of just looking at the police as the only solution, we also saw that those of us who work in health also have a responsibility because of the health impacts that violence has. So domestic violence, I got involved listening to patients' experiences, to survivors of domestic violence, to have them tell us, what do we got to learn? Because I have learned from the time I was young, that if you're going to help some folks, then you got to ask them, what is it that we can do to make things better? So my start was to listen to those survivors and ask them about their experiences in healthcare, and then, which were mostly negative at that point, and doctors not wanting to listen, mostly because we were uncomfortable. And then saying, okay, what can we do? And how can we do it? And then teaching everybody, not just the physicians, but the nurses, the MAs, the whole team, so that the whole system becomes sensitized to how we can do things in a more effective way, to take advantage of these opportunities that we have to help to move in a new direction. And so the same thing was happening with youth. when we started to look at youth and the violence that's happening, we started to realize, wow, one of the things that's happening is that when there's guns around, no surprise, the injuries are worse and the likelihood for death also goes up.
Mm.
And so we needed to find out what's going on, what's happening in communities, and how can we help reduce the access, particularly to handguns, because those are the ones that were dangerous and that young people were using, and that increase the risk of injury and deaths. And so again, part of the movement was to make people aware that really the handguns, what we're finding from the research is that it puts us us and our families at more risk of danger than protects us, as many people popularly feel. And so we worked with communities up and down California. We learned information. We published the information about the dangers, and then we worked with our policymakers. And the process of working together, the white coats, the physicians, with the blue coats, the police working together. What for? For the health and well-being of communities and youth who were at high risk of dying from gun violence. And we are able to actually pass some laws that reduce access to these dangerous products, consumer products, and increase safety. Same way that we do pass laws to protect ourselves and minimize our injuries and deaths from cars by wearing seat belts, having safe driving limits, and creating safe cars like these sort of airbags. And so all those type of things we do so that we can make sure that we have more safety. And so for me, it's been an honor to work with survivors, community members, other physicians, researchers, and policymakers to look at violence as a public health issue and to do things to help to prevent it.
Well, and such like beautiful and important work to look at some of these things as health concerns and health crises. You know, it made such a difference. Even when racism was declared a health crisis, you know, we do a lot of focus on that in this show, and just it shifted everything of how we looked at racism and gave it a little validity that I think a lot of like white folks and people who'd never experienced racism didn't understand, and it made it a little more tangible for people. So that's beautiful. So I have one last question for you, and it is the question that I ask everyone who comes on this show, because I am an expert joy hunter. Where are you finding your joy today?
Well, Andrew, today I'm finding my joy by talking with you, because this is an opportunity to connect. And one of the things I'm appreciating more and more is that at the end of the day, the way in which we move forward to promote health is to love each other, is to connect with each other. And we love each other through connection. And that when we have a chance to connect, especially this is the first time we're meeting, and I'm going, boy, you're such a great person, and you're doing such a great job, great service here to the community. And for me, I get a joy, I get an honor. And so it really is to be grateful for the moment that we have to share this information and to connect with other people, because back to the whole issue about racism, you know, that's yet but one form of discrimination. So many different forms. We are such different people, you know, and color of our skin is just one aspect, as is gender, as is whether we're born in the US or not. So the issues of immigrants and xenophobia, homophobia, you know, are sort of our you know, there's a number of different issues that make us different. But when we connect, we have a chance to sort of close that gap between us. And when we do that, then we realize that the humanity that all of us have, the goodness inside each other, and we really appreciate and value what lucky people we are to be connecting to other folks who are different and provide us with opportunities to learn more about ourselves and about other people and their cultures as well. And so for me, that's what it's all about, because brother, it is all about us being connected, us going together forward, and everybody goes up. Doesn't matter who you are, because our health is only limited by the people who are having the least of the resources available to them. So we want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to move forward and do the best they can. And we do that by connecting with folks and breaking down those silos and breaking down the stereotypes and holding hands in ways that are symbolic and in ways that are real, so that what we do makes a difference. So why do I have joy? Because I'm here with you, and I have faith that out there's going to be some folks who feel the same way. And hopefully by listening to you, and perhaps also to me a little bit, there might be some inspiration that, I want to join these movements. I want to be part of what I want to see in this world.
Pure poetry, Doc. That was pure poetry. Come on, let's go. Come back, that connection. He said it's symbolic and real, y'all. Make sure we do not forget. We need both of these things. We need that symbolic, and we also need that real. It has been an absolute pleasure to connect with you, Dr. Rodriguez. We'll have to have you back onto the show. Also, because I want to talk family recipes. I think between the Mexican and the Salvadorian, you had to have eaten better than anyone that I've ever met.
It's good.
We'll have to connect again soon. But until then, please take care of yourself, and thank you so much for who you are and all you do.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and an honor, and I'll come back anytime.
In addition to AAPI Heritage Month and Mental Health Month, May is National Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month. And this next story is at the very center of women's rights as well as pregnancy prevention. See, with new judges on the Supreme Court, is it possible that the landmark Roe v. Wade decision will get overturned? The highest court in the land has decided to take on a groundbreaking case that could shift one of the foundations of women's rights as we know it. Here's a clip from the Today Show to explain a little more about what's going on.
The court will decide whether Mississippi violated the Constitution when it passed a law in 2018 to ban nearly all abortions after the 15th week of pregnancy, saying that advancements in medical knowledge have shifted the time when a fetus can feel pain.
What we're hoping to see is that with this case, the court will take the handcuffs off of the states and allow them to pass laws that reflect the values of the people that live there.
Lower courts struck the law down, saying it ran counter to a string of the Supreme Court's abortion rights rulings since 1973 that said states cannot flat out ban abortion before fetal viability around 23 weeks of pregnancy. But now the Supreme Court says it will take another look at that very issue, agreeing to hear Mississippi's appeal. Supporters of abortion rights say it's an ominous sign.
There's no way that the Supreme Court can uphold the restriction on abortion that Mississippi has in place without reversing Roe versus Wade.
Two of the justices who consistently voted to uphold core abortion rights are gone, Anthony Kennedy and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, replaced by two appointees of President Trump, who said during his campaign that his court nominees would oppose abortion rights.
I am pro-life, and I will be appointing pro-life judges.
Abortion opponents are hoping Amy Coney Barrett, who succeeded Justice Ginsburg, will give them the majority they need to uphold a Mississippi law. The court will hear this case in the fall during its next term, with a decision probably about a year from now. The Mississippi law, meantime, remains blocked and cannot be enforced.
So we heard earlier in the show that last year's lockdown stopped the flu and other major viruses, but what it didn't stop was the homicide rates in California. Throughout the state, rates were up from LA and the Bay to Stockton and Sacramento. In fact, the number of homicides per 100,000 California residents rose to its highest level since 2008. Kaiser Health News dug through the data in this recent article. California registered a devastating surge in homicides in 2020 that hit especially hard in Black and Latino communities. The number of homicide victims in California jumped 27% from 2019 to 2020 to about 2,300, marking the largest year-over-year increase in 3 decades, according to preliminary death certificate data from the California Department of Public Health. There were 5.8 homicides per 100,000 residents in 2020, the highest rate in California since 2008. Similar increases were seen all over the nation. The number of homicides in a sampling of large cities grew 32% from 2019 to 2020, according to preliminary FBI data. The data encompasses over 200 cities with more than 100,000 people, but does not include some big cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia that didn't even report. The California death certificate data reveals striking disparities in who fell victim to homicide in 2020. The number of homicides that took the lives of Black Californians rose 36% from 2019 to 2020, while homicides that took Hispanic lives rose 30%. By comparison, the number of white homicide victims only rose 15%, and this number of Asian victims rose 10%. Most victims of homicide in 2020 were young, between 15 and 34 years old. The number of homicide victims in this age group rose from about 900 in 2019 to 1,175 in 2020. That's a 31% rise. Firearms were the most common instrument of death, and the number of homicides involving guns rose 35% in 2020. Extending another long-standing trend, males were 5 times as likely to be the victims of homicide as females. The number of male victims rose 30% in 2020, compared with a 14% rise in female victims. The increase in deadly violence played out across large swaths of the state, urban and rural, and was keenly felt in the San Francisco Bay Area. Among California's 10 most populous counties, the sharpest increases were reported in Alameda County, where homicides rose 57%, followed by Fresno at 44%, Sacramento at 36%, and Los Angeles at 32%. Only one of the 10 most populous counties, Contra Costa, saw a decline in homicides last year. Law enforcement officials and criminologists said an increase in conflict among young adults, particularly those in street gangs, was a significant factor in the violence. They noted that schools and sports programs shut down as COVID-19 surged, as did large numbers of community and nonprofit programs that provide support, recreational outlets, and intervention services for at-risk youth. Georgia Leap, a UCLA anthropologist and expert in gangs, violence, and trauma, said the restrictions on youth intervention programs and other healthy activities played a huge role in the rise of violence. These sports after school, football, basketball, whatever it might be, all that is stopped, said Leap, a faculty member at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. So frankly, you got a lot of adolescent and young adult energies out there. Leap said young adults were particularly vulnerable to the mental toll of the pandemic. They finally get programs, they have people interested in them, and then it's all of a sudden withdrawn, she said. Pandemic-fueled anxiety and isolation corresponded with a huge increase in gun sales, which Leap said may also explain some of the increase in homicides. I'm worried about how easy it has been to get a gun during such a crisis time in America, she said. It's not a pick one factor, she added. All of these factors reinforce each other. With mass vaccinations taking place across the state and nation, more places are reopening and young adults have more options to engage in something positive. But Leap said it will take a broad effort to bolster jobs and education, along with short-term intervention aimed at those still hurting from the pandemic to improve the social conditions that contributed to the increase in homicides. As much as we've never dealt with a global pandemic in modern times, we've never dealt with the aftermath of a global pandemic either, she said. Since we are talking about social determinants of health, it is only fitting that we bring an expert on. Dr. Anthony Hatch is a sociologist, an associate professor, and chair of the Science in Society program at Wesleyan University, where he is also affiliated faculty in the Department of African American Studies, the College of the Environment, and the Department of Sociology. He is also the author of Silent Cells, The Secret Drugging of Captive America, and Blood Sugar, Racial Pharmacology and Food Justice in Black America. Y'all, welcome Dr. Anthony Hatch to the show. Dr. Hatch, how are you today?
I'm well, sir. How are you? Peace and greetings.
Man, I'm so excited to have this conversation, and it almost didn't happen because of some wild shenanigans going on out in the world. But we got to do it, and I'm so excited to talk to you. You've got a range of things, so we are going to cover a whole range today, and we're going to start off with you've done a lot of research regarding corruption and a lack of transparency within our prison systems. Can you tell us a little bit about these findings, specifically in regards to your book, Silent Cells?
Absolutely, and it is good to be with you. And events conspired to bring us back together. So I'm grateful for the chance to talk about some of this work and share this with your viewers, your listeners, with the folks out there. The work I've done in my book Silent Cells, The Secret Drugging of Captive America, really takes on a question that I really wanted to know the answer to. Back in 2009, I met a woman who was a psychiatrist in the Georgia Department of Corrections, and she said something to me in a meeting that just stirred me. She said that the warden would send her and her staff a nice bottle of something at the holiday time because he knew that the psychiatrist and the staff kept the prisons quiet. And so I just became intrigued by this question of whether or not, and to what extent, and how, and to what ends the kind of American carceral system uses psychotropics for any purpose, for all purposes, and really trying to zero in on this question of, was this doctor right? Were prisons using psychotropics to essentially to keep a lid on, to maintain mass incarceration, right? If you can keep a certain segment of the population thorazined out, it's going to allow you to do mass incarceration differently. So I was really interested in that history and really exploring the entire history of the use of psychopharmacology in the American prison system, and trying to zero in on this question of whether or not they were being used to maintain a captive population. And I think the answer that I found raises some of the questions that you suggest, right, around corruption, around privacy, around the secrecy. Everything that I analyze in the book is publicly available information, publicly available data. Not one FOIA request, not one secret interview. I didn't have to ask Power's permission to do this project. It was really trying to look at the publicly available record to see what it said, and then what it shows is pretty damning. If that's a start to the question.
Yeah.
In order for us to understand whether or not prisons are engaging in these kinds of practices of forcible drugging, drugging people against their will, drugging people so that they can be held competent to stand trial, which is a practice that's done here in the United States, using psychotropics as so-called truth serum in the so-called war on terror. In one of the most devastating to me cases I explore in the book, the use of psychotropics in the foster system, among young children, right, who are held as wards of the state in all these different settings. Our social institutions are using these drugs to great effect, and all those connections are what I wanted to explore and unearth.
Yeah, y'all make sure you go pick up Silent Cells. And what can we learn from your book? I mean, just this is a really broad question. What can we learn from your book in terms of the need for prison and police reform?
I mean, this is one of the animating forces in the project for me. What are the anchors of our carceral order and the United States specifically? Although these systems do, of course, have parallels and connections internationally, but the United States, it seems to be a unique case. And so I was interested in, what were the forces. In particular, this book examines what are the technologies, right? What in the book we call carceral technologies, along with my colleague Ruha Benjamin and many others, thinking about all these different technologies and systems that are designed to keep people locked in place, fixed, contained. So everything from the architectural design and materials, all the way through to the food systems, as well as the health and pharmaceuticals delivery systems, which is what I was focused on in Silent Cells. What role do these technologies play in upholding the system? And if you were to take the technology away, could we do mass incarceration the same way? So I was very much interested in how this research could inform an abolitionist politics that aims to say, all right, you can't actually do mass incarceration this way without this technology. This technology, this which on one hand can be used in the context of medicine, in the context of constitutionally protected standards for healthcare, right, can also be used to punish and to coerce. And so that is a dynamic that the book, the attention that the book explores. But this is really a fundamental question of reform. On the one hand, my book, in the book, I argue that one institution that could use reform is the prison pharmacy, right? Prisons are the conduit for vast quantities of pharmaceutical and medical products, all of which get filtered through an entire network of pharmacy systems and corporations that are providing billions of dollars of goods and services to the system to maintain the health and well-being of people who are incarcerated. You have to know, Andrew, that as of 1976, people who are incarcerated in these United States are the only group of persons who have had effectively a constitutional right to health care. As of 1976, in the Supreme Court case Estelle versus Gamble, this established the standard of deliberate indifference, which means effectively that the state can't knowingly not care whether you live or die. They can't knowingly turn a blind eye to suffering that they are principally and solely responsible for maintaining, right? So if they're holding you captive, they just can't let you languish and die, right? Of course, except in cases where they do in fact do that, right? The state can kill you, but it's less about the state killing you and more about the state investing you with life and trying to keep you alive. So in a situation like that, in a prison, you have a situation where we have to know, what drugs are being given out to whom, why, for what period of time, who signed off on it, where's the receipt. And so when, with a colleague of mine and I, Renee Shelby, in one of the chapters in the book we call it the pharmacy prison, we looked at a set of publicly available audits of prison pharmacies. These are situations where the government's looking at itself to see what did we do, right, in our pharmacy system. And what those audits show is that the government in many cases doesn't even know what it's doing in its own system. So this is an obvious area for reform where they should have adequate record keeping systems, and they should be subject to regularized audit procedures by independent groups. That's an easy reform. Much harder and a much more difficult problem to confront is the way in which these medicines, these drugs are used across social institutions, from the prison to the military to the nursing homes to the foster care system, right, and so on. Is used in so many, in schools, in so many institutions to maintain a sense of order that that's where reform doesn't seem like enough. And so that's the space the book tried to open up in the context specifically of prisons, but also in these other spaces.
Fascinating work, and we're just gonna keep shifting down your bookshelf, right? Because we're gonna move into your book, Blood Sugar: Racial Pharmacology and Food Justice in Black America. It talks about the impact of metabolic syndrome on the Black community. First off, what exactly is metabolic syndrome, and why are communities of color disproportionately affected by these diseases?
I like the walk. I like the walk backward down the bookshelf. And there are connections between these projects, which we might have a chance to explore. But metabolic syndrome is something that most folks probably haven't heard of, right, in its name. But you know what I'm talking about. Metabolic syndrome is this idea created by epidemiologists and medical researchers and physicians to try to understand who is at the greatest risk of having a heart attack or stroke. So a person is said to have metabolic syndrome if they have high blood sugar, if they have high blood pressure, have hypertension, if they have high cholesterol, right? If they're overweight or obese. And depending on which measurement is used and whose definition of metabolic syndrome you're talking about, there's usually some other biological marker of inflammation in the body. Right, the inflammatory process is the process that that translates diabetes into heart disease, essentially. Right, most people who have diabetes die from heart disease, not from diabetes per se. So, metabolic syndrome is this term that researchers developed to try to understand who is at the greatest risk. So, if you had 3 out of 5 of those factors, right, you had like double the risk. So this was an important idea in public health research because one of the things it aimed to do was to communicate to the citizenry who is in fact at risk. And as you alluded to in the question, and as the book explored, questions of race and racial difference, specifically around African Americans, have become a central feature of this research on metabolic syndrome in all kinds of interesting ways that the book explores. Of course, at the heart of the book is really diabetes. The title Blood Sugar, I relay my own experiences as a type 1 diabetic, longtime type 1 diabetic in the book, and the real enduring daily battle to kind of keep blood sugar managed in an environment, particularly in the United States, that is inundated with sugar-rich colonial system. Right? Mm-hmm. All that colonial sugar just sitting everywhere for all of us. And so someone's got to eat it. And so once consumed, all that sugar translates into all this kind of endemic metabolic disease, which of course is profoundly racialized and profoundly class structured as well. So in the book, I don't just examine, the history of metabolic syndrome and how this kind of problem as a health problem. I also turn the lens on the scientists who were researching and writing about metabolic syndrome. And in that research, you can see them saying things that sound like scientific racism, right? African Americans are more likely to develop metabolic syndrome because of some genetic trait that they do or don't have. African Americans are more likely to respond differently to some particular medicine or a particular pharmaceutical because of some genetic or biological factor. So what happens in this research on metabolic syndrome is that the environmental and political and social forces that create disease tend to get kind of sidestepped and ignored. And what tends to get focused on are these minute biological and genetic kind of research programs that end up producing ideas about race that make it even harder to look at those structural forces that create disease.
Well, and that was my next question. Why is it so important for us to consider social factors rather than just biological factors when discussing health?
It's a key question, but let's reframe it just for a moment, because what happens is that the social enters into the body, right? The human body is an open system that we are beings. We are biological beings. We inherit the social order. It becomes us. And so our position in the social structure, right? Our position in the generations, literally, whether or not your parents lived through a famine, right, determines how you respond to your metabolic environment today. Right. So there have been studies of again, the Irish potato famine, and that second generation coming out of that, you see clear differences. So it's about recognizing the ways in which the social environment is expressed through unequal biology, right? It produces unequal biologies such that some biological beings live shorter lives than others. And the trap is when scientists deluded under the guise of scientific racism look at those bodies and say, "Oh, that body died because of its race," as opposed to because of its position in the social hierarchy or because of the environment that it was forced to live in due to segregation or so on and so forth. So the explanations that scientists produce are extremely important in how we as a collectivity confront health inequality and how we devise, even if this is possible, social policy that can actually remedy those inequalities. Scientists play a key role in that. And so the book, doesn't, I think a lot of my work doesn't let the scientists and researchers off the hook because they, science and technology, these are key forces in our social order. And they play a big role in how inequality is confronted, particularly when it comes to bodies and health. So it's also important for everyday folk, right? If I believe that my health, that the health challenges I face are due to something I inherited, right? Something that I have absolutely no control over, right? That's not an empowering situation. And that's actually not even scientifically accurate. We have enormous capacity for transforming the conditions of our lives, right? This is a key lesson of sociology. I am a sociologist, and we can in fact create, social orders that are more conducive to human thriving, if I will, and multi-species thriving. So we got to get the story straight. If we're over here talking about genetics and genetics and genetics, then we're not talking about, wealth inequality. We're not talking about, income inequality. We're not talking about, dismantling the health insurance system, right? We're talking about it's in some ways a way to gaslight and distract people from the kinds of real transformations that will in fact lead to improved health.
Oh, that reframe. That was a 24 karat reframe. Thank you so much, Doctor. So I have one last question for you, and it is the question I ask everyone who comes on this show because we try to keep the joy hunt going on around here. Where are you finding your joy these days?
Oh man, I love the question. And these days I find my joy in putting my windows down. I crank my little 2003 stereo speakers up, and I bump whatever playlist I can pull up. I have my kids will make me a playlist, 90s hip hop, anything I can. So today, actually, I thought of it was KRS-One. I was listening to KRS-One, and KRS-One mix coming in, and so to me, it's trying to have a connection to to music. It's having a connection to creativity, to creation, and especially in this moment, with death lurking around the corner, really trying to just stay grounded in that and sing a song.
You heard it from the good doctor, y'all. Get some hip hop in your life.
The KRS-One.
The teacher, classic.
Yeah, not to be missed anyway. So I appreciate the question.
Absolutely. And we appreciate your time and you taking the time to help us readjust some of these frameworks that we've been handed and help us undo the programming out here. It's so crucial. And just thank you for who you are and all that you're doing. We'll have to have you back on. And maybe next time we'll talk a little bit more hip hop and a little less medicine.
Hip hop sounds great. And I again, everybody, it's time to get counter programming going. And counter programming is very important. that deprogramming and counter programming. So I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So there is a whole segment on this show called Netta Found This, where we share with you something that research extraordinaire Netta Ashtari found. And this week, she asked me if I thought most people still thought that we only use 10% of our brains. I don't know if most people do, but I know I was one of the people who did until she let me know. Check this video out from Free Med Education.
Question: do we use only 10% of our brains? This is one of the most commonly promoted and repeated phrases by motivational speakers and many others since the beginning of the last century. Today, however, radiologists and neuroscientists can look at any brain scan, measure brain activity at any given time, and have a good laugh at the idea. Imaging techniques such as positron emission tomography, PET, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, allow doctors and scientists to map and watch brain activity in real time. The truth is that your entire brain is playing its part. If only 10% of the brain is normally being used, then damage to the other areas of the brain should not impair performance. Instead, there is almost no area of the brain that can be damaged without loss of abilities. Even slight damage to small areas of the brain can have profound effects. Obviously, this is bad news for anyone hoping to find the secret to becoming a genius overnight. The good news, though, is that hard work still works. There is plenty of reason to believe that you can build brain power by regularly working at challenging mental tasks. In fact, your brain is capable of neuroplasticity. It is the ability of the brain to change continuously throughout an individual's life.
Neuroplasticity. Noted. We'll get into that some other time, but what if everything we've been told about the brain was a lie? Like, are we even left-brained or right-brained? If only there was a video.
Behold the human brain, its lumpy landscape visibly split into a left and right side. This structure has inspired one of the most pervasive ideas about the brain, that the left side controls logic and the right creativity. And yet, this is a myth, unsupported by scientific evidence. So how did this misleading idea come about, and what does it get wrong? It's true that the brain has a right and a left side. This is most apparent with the outer layer, or the cortex. Internal regions, like the striatum, hypothalamus, thalamus, and brainstem, appear to be made from continuous tissue, but in fact, they're also organized with left and right sides. The left and the right sides of the brain do control different body functions, such as movement and sight. The brain's right side controls the motion of the left arm and leg, and vice versa. The visual system is even more complex. Each eye has a left and right visual field. Both left visual fields are sent to the right side of the brain, and both right fields are sent to the left side. So the brain uses both sides to make a complete image of the world. Scientists don't know for sure why we have that crossing over. One theory is it began soon after animals developed more complex nervous systems, because it gave the survival advantage of quicker reflexes. If an animal sees a predator coming from its left side, it's best off escaping to the right. So we can say that vision and movement control are two systems that rely on this left-right structure. But problems arise when we overextend that idea to logic and creativity. This misconception began in the mid-1800s when two neurologists, Broca and Wernicke, examined patients who had problems communicating due to injuries. The researchers found damage to the patient's left temporal lobes, so they suggested that language is controlled by the left side of the brain. That captured the popular imagination. Author Robert Louis Stevenson then introduced the idea of a logical left hemisphere competing with an emotional right hemisphere, represented by his characters, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But this idea didn't hold up when doctors and scientists examined patients who were missing a hemisphere or had their two hemispheres separated. These patients showed a complete range of behaviors, both logical and creative. Later research showed that one side of the brain is more active than the other for some functions. Language is more localized to the left and attention to the right. So one side of the brain may do more work, but this varies by system rather than by person. There isn't any evidence to suggest that individuals have dominant sides of the brain, or to support the idea of a left-right split between logic and creativity. Some people may be particularly logical or creative, but that has nothing to do with the sides of their brains. And even the idea of logic and creativity being at odds with each other doesn't hold up well. Solving complex math problems requires inspired creativity, and many vibrant works of art have intricate logical frameworks. Almost every feat of creativity and logic carries the mark of the whole brain functioning as one.
So that brings us to the end of another episode of Masked Up. We want to thank the half of the internet that tunes in every week. I am Andrew Defy. As always, shout out and big thanks to Netta, Allison, and the rest of the Masked Up crew. You are the sour cream to my guacamole, and not just because we're all a little extra. Like we always do at this time, y'all, from all of us to all of you, like Mozzie said, health is wealth, and I need my bag. Covered faces don't get cases. Health don't come from a pharmacy, y'all. Till next time.